I'm assuming this goes for everybody, but who would have thought we would be talking about number 18 Pitt versus number 20 SMU with legitimate ACC title and potentially playoff implications here? I mean, going into the season, Pat Narduzzi and the Pitt Panthers, they were coming off a 3-9 season, did a complete overhaul in terms of their offensive staff, and brought in Cade Bell, whose background was head coach at Western Carolina, who typically runs kind of a, no huddle, fast paced, pass oriented offense whereas when you go back and you think of, Paul Christ or Dave Weinstadt or, some of those other coaches, it was primarily a, you know, zone zone run, pro style kind of offense. And it's totally night and day what we've seen too, especially when you see Eli Holstein, who's first quarterback to win his first 7 starts ever since, Dan Marino back in 1979, I believe the date is. But definitely super, super exciting for a number of reasons. I mean, it's such a Jekyll and Hyde in terms of, talking about these two, especially even last week. I mean, you think to yourself, wow, Pitt had, 5 interceptions against Kyle McCord and, routed them 41-13. Whereas we look at this SMU team who barely squeaked by a really strong defensive team in Duke when they won 28-27 and really only won that and really primarily won that game. It really came down to a 2-point conversion, which Duke ultimately failed on. But going into this game, there are, 3 key factors in terms of, how this game is going to turn out. First and foremost, in talking about Pitt too, Pitt also has Clemson next week too. So if they were to squeak by SMU, that game is also going to be equally as important in terms of their, ACC title implications as well as the playoff right now. As it stands, College Football Index has Pitt at approximately 25% in terms of making the college football playoff. So this is definitely essential in terms of them, making a possible run. But no matter how you dice this, I mean, Pitt and SMU have both exceeded expectations. And I, for one, have not followed much SMU this year. I've seen a handful of games. I remember their, heartbreaking loss versus BYU when they lost 18-15, which is their only loss this year. And I did watch a good amount of the Duke game too. Now, Kevin Jennings, what he does have going for him, which I think will be a bit of a challenge for Pitt, is that for the most part, he's a relatively accurate quarterback. He's a dual threat. And for the most part, the accuracy really, has really been quite solid, all things considered, especially when he took over for Preston Stone earlier in the year. And I think one of the key factors that I'm going to get into, first of all, is, which quarterback is going to make less mistakes, really, because I think if you're an SMU fan, one of the storylines I'm going to have is, okay, for the most part, Kevin Jennings, he's thrown for 10 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. And, a handful of those came last week versus a really strong Duke team. And, Pitt definitely they're good on deep. I think they're good on defense, but I think the primary strength of that team is within their linebacking core and the defensive line. So when you when you piece this all together, one big factor that I think is being a little bit underplayed in terms of this SME matchup is Kevin Jennings being able to use his feet and be able to get some plays that way. Because looking back at Pitt's schedule this year, the only other really legitimate dual threat quarterback that they faced was when they played West Virginia and Garrett Green at the backyard brawl. So I don't think Pitt is really being able to face many kind of dual threat quarterbacks, because even when you outside of the dual threat element of SMU, in many ways this matchup reminds me of another game I covered a couple weeks ago, which was Pitt versus UCal. And what I mean by that, in the sense of, one of the key factors I just alluded to is going to be who makes less mistakes in this game. Now, Eli Holstein, for the most part, I think has been terrific. He has 20 touchdowns combined, 17 passing, 3 rushing, and is right now the leading rusher on this team, even past Desmond Reed, who's actually been pretty useful for him too. And yes, they haven't necessarily run the ball as much, and yes, Eli Holstein has been a gamer. He's willing to take chances and do all of that. But, as we, for example, to me, the biggest weakness in terms of the Pitt game was watching that UCal team. And I said it over and over again when previewing that game, was that their UCal secondary is legit. I don't care how many times that they can't close out a game or they end up losing by 1 point or whatever that is. The reality is that their defense, particularly their secondary, is legit. And if SMU is going to win this game, one of those storylines is going to have to be, can they limit those explosive plays that Eli Holstein and this Cade Bell offense has been accustomed to throughout this season? Because they've SMU's defense primarily this year has been being aggressive, pressuring the quarterback, seeing a lot of man coverage in terms of SMU, and also willing to be aggressive and take chances too, which is the one thing that I have really admired about Rhett Lashley, who they won the 2023 AAC title, and definitely one of the up and coming coaches in all of college football. 25-10 into his third year at SMU, and also his first year within the ACC. But if you're SMU, if you're an SMU fan, that's definitely one of the big questions that you have to ask yourself is, can they get past this Pitt offense that for the most part has been pretty solid this year? And secondarily, can you be aggressive enough to the point where Holstein can't get away with some of those 50-50 balls that he has kind of been accustomed to getting used to throughout the season? And if you do and if you are able to make him pay for a couple of those, can your balance attack of SMU in general? I mean, I think they do a really good job being able to have the run just enough to be a threat, but also at the same time to the point where you can trust Kevin Jennings to make those accurate reads, to have enough poise, and to ultimately get some sustainable drives down the field. Now, I know they had 6 turnovers last week against Duke and all that too, but I really do anticipate this really strong SMU team who's averaged 39 points this season to bounce back and really make it truly competitive. Now, kind of flipping to the Pitt side of it, I briefly mentioned that Eli Holstein, for the most part, I think has gone away with a couple more throws than I think you would, one would like to see. I think there's been a couple dropped interceptions that I think are certainly worth, noteworthy. But at the same time, too, they've done a terrific job at being able to really spread the field, using those RPOs and those screen plays that have really been, something in college football, at least schematically speaking, that has, really kind of taken over college football in a number of different ways, and one that I think will only evolve as time progresses too. And if you're this Pitt offense, and obviously last week you didn't have to really rely too much on your offense, given that the Pitt defense primarily carried the burden and mainly was the reason that you guys got the win. But Pat Narduzzi did announce this week that Holstein could possibly be a game time decision, which very similar to Drew Allar, they're obviously not gonna announce whether he's playing or not. I mean, that would just be silly. So Nate Yarnell, who's their backup quarterback and has been on the Pitt roster, he's been taking some first team reps, and I think if you're SMU, you're going to prepare for Nate Yarnell, but I think in reality, it's more than likely that Holstein will be out there. They didn't say what type of injury it's going to be, but I think for all intents and purposes, I'd be pretty remiss if somehow Holstein were to miss what's in essence been probably going to be the biggest matchup that they have in a long time. I mean, even I've talked about on this show before how they won the 2021 ACC title, and then kind of after that, it's been sort of fluttering too. But props to Pitt too, who Pat Narduzzi took a stand and said, hey, we're this offseason, really good article by Yahoo Sports, and they articulate this, how they've completely overhauled their NIL standards. They've brought in a really good collective, and that collective is also sort of, managed by Doug Wiley, who's a former general manager of the Buffalo Bills. And they've also brought in Alan Green, new athletic director, who, has a rich history in the SEC, and also being able to fundraise and really tap into NIL, which is something in the future that I think Pitt's going to be doing a lot more, much like we're going to be seeing SMU doing, because as everybody knows, SMU has a very rich endowment and is one of the many reasons why they pretty much, told the ACC, hey, we'll come here and not have to have any of the revenue for, I don't remember how many seasons it was. I think it's at least the first 5 or 6. It may even be more than that off the top of my head. But I covered the two main quarterbacks. Obviously it's going to come down to who makes less mental mistakes, especially Eli Holstein being a redshirt freshman, coming from Alabama, and also Kevin Jennings too, who started off the year being number 2 and has made the most of this moment. So ton of props to both those quarterbacks. And I mentioned SMU obviously needing to limit the explosive plays if they are going to be able to have that balanced attack and really put up points too. But I think the last element in terms of who wins this game is how effective can Pitt be on third down, because I think in many ways this game will come down to who can really control the tempo of the game. Now I think if you're Pitt, you're kind of asking yourself, okay, SMU for the most part has been a pretty consistent team, all things considered, and their defense has been quite solid, and you really don't see too many weaknesses there. So when you find those key matchups and you find those weaknesses, how can you make sure that the tempo is being fast enough to the point where you're taking advantage of those, allowing Eli Holstein to get some confidence early, because especially they're on the road too at Gerald Ford Stadium. And if you're Pat Narduzzi and this offensive staff, I think one of the keys here is you're going to have to get them going early, and you're going to have to make sure that you simply can't afford the third down conversions that you had against Syracuse and UCal and some of the other games that they played this year. Because if they do anything like that and SMU can keep that Pitt defense out on the field for long periods of time, I have some trouble believing that that Pitt back against the wall can really have another comeback win. I mean, we saw earlier in the year they had comeback wins versus West Virginia and Cincinnati, and I think the key fundamental difference between Cincinnati and West Virginia versus SMU team is that SMU's defense is a hell of a lot better than West Virginia and Cincinnati. I mean, nothing against West Virginia and Cincinnati, but there were clear defensive inefficiencies that aren't quite as obvious with this SMU team. So, if SMU can still, get that pressure on Eli Holstein and really wreak havoc back there, I think this is another one of those sort of trap games that I think that's kind of the common phrasing now is the trap game or the upset game or whatever you want to call it. But the reality right now is no matter what, both these teams have over exceeded expectations, and regardless of how it turns out, you should be pretty damn proud about what you've accomplished. But right now, Pitt is having a historical season right now, and in order for them to get past SMU and also meet Clemson, hopefully both those teams being undefeated and being at, I'm still calling it Heinz Field. I'm not calling it Accenture Stadium. So showing up at Heinz Field, what they need to do to show up undefeated is they got to convert on third down, make sure that offensive line is giving Holstein enough time to be able to control the tempo of the game, being able to, find those mismatches, and most importantly, get them comfortable early. And then if you're SMU, don't be afraid to use Kevin Jennings in the run game. Pitt hasn't seen many dual threat quarterbacks. Don't be afraid to be a little bit aggressive, especially you want to play spoiler in this ACC race too. And then most importantly, stop them on third down. Don't let them get momentum early, and let the home crowd play a key factor in this game, which I do anticipate happening.